Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Peace Studio Summit. This is our very first panel, and we'll be bringing together two topics that are consistently making national headlines: racism and mental health. In response to the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter protests peaked in June 2020, when more than 500,000 people turned out in more than 550 places across the United States. During that same year, hate crimes against Asian Americans increased by more than 150%. Now, while racism has existed across the world for centuries, some would say that we're in the midst of a national reckoning on race. As a as a mental health equity advocate, I've spent most of my career equipping individuals with tools they need to recognize the signs and symptoms related to mental health through programs like Mental Health First Aid and addressing public mental health disparities. Today, we'll be discussing ways that BIPOC journalists, artists, and communities can maintain mental health as they work together to share their stories and their art that combats these systems of oppression. As we begin and throughout our time together, please feel free to head to the chat now to enter your questions in the box on the Peace Studio Summit website. Joining me in today's conversation is the Associate Editor of the Asian American Journal of Psychology, Tiffany Yip, founder of Latinx therapy and trauma therapist, Adriana Alejandre, and physician, epidemiologist, and anti-racism activist, Dr. Camara Jones. Thank you so much to each of you for being here. I think we should jump in and get started. So my first question is definitely for all three of you, and feel free to jump in. For the BIPOC artists and journalists that are reporting on legislation and photographing protests and painting portraits of the victims and responding to race-related events, there is a impact, right? And so what are the creative ways and advice that you would give them that before they start that kind of work, how can they start to build their resilience and strengthen their mental health before facing those kinds of triggering or mentally distressing events? Let's start with Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you, Tramaine. It's so nice to be here with all of you to discuss this really important topic. Um, the work that you're describing is incredibly emotionally taxing, and I think we all recognize that. But unfortunately, as individuals of color, it's not a new type of tax, right? We're all familiar with it. I mean, I think this COVID reckoning that you're talking about, unfortunately, is not new, but it does feel like it's got some momentum that it didn't have before. And so, my advice for people as you sort of armor up to do this really difficult work is to tap into some of those resources that we had before the pandemic, right? What were some of the ways that you would cope with racism in your daily life before, right? Because those resources hopefully are still available to you. It may come in a different form. It may be remote rather than in person, or it may be new networks that you developed over the pandemic. But those support networks that we've always relied on, even prior to the pandemic, are hopefully still available to you. And so some of the ways in which we've reimagined support, I would encourage us to sort of still look at the ways that we did things before the pandemic as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Jones.
So I really appreciate Tiffany's talking about support networks and the collective. The worst thing is for each of us to sort of feel like we're in this battle by ourselves. Collective action is power. It's going to inform us. It's going to protect us, propel us. And so even as an artist or a journalist, make sure that you are connecting with others who are doing the same kind of work, just for the spiritual connection as well as tips and concrete stuff. I liken it to an image. When you see geese flying either north or south, and you see them flying in that V formation, it's because the goose at the front is breaking the wind for those who come behind, breaking the wind for those who come behind. And I used to worry about that goose in the front. Because what happens when they're tired? Do they just fall to the ground or fly off someplace random? No, they don't. What they do is they move from the front and let somebody else take the lead. So
Yeah.
what each of us needs to do is to either identify or grow our own flock in whatever work we're doing, and then take turns in terms of leadership and bearing the brunt of the work. That way we can spell each other and we can all stay. We have to develop our flock, decide what direction we're going in, and then take turns in leadership, and we'll all get there.
Wow, absolutely. That is just so, such an image, right? It's seared in your mind. Adriana, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I really love that image. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for bringing that up. It's so beautiful. And community is so important when doing activism work. It is pivotal, it is everything, because it can feel like such a lonely experience to experience racism and discrimination when it isn't. And I work with a lot of activists as a therapist myself. And so one of the biggest things that I hear about is burnout. And so making sure that every person has their collective way to self-care and also their individual way of providing self-care. Some of that self-care can include boundary work. So what kind of internal and external boundaries do you need to set in place? And these boundaries are things that I do recommend that you think about before going out into the field, before starting the activism, so that you're kind of aware. Finding out and becoming aware of what are some of your triggers can also be very beneficial, so that you can, like how Dr. Jones was saying, lean on someone else when you are experiencing a trigger. And knowing that therapy and or support groups are available for you. And so many activists also get a group of peer-led folks, so that you can do an internal, peer-led support group. And I think that that's also a beautiful way if you're not ready to do a therapy support group, for example. But these are some options.
Those are so useful. I really like the way that all three of you hit on this opportunity around community and engagement with that community, and those tools that we already have inherent within are addressing the fact that we are experiencing these things before last year and will continue to in the future. But that shared responsibility, as well as how we move forward together, identifying places where we are tired, knowing what our boundaries are, right? And figuring out how to really engage in ways that are meaningful. That makes me think a little bit of the fact that what are we experiencing? How do we name it? And Dr. Jones, your work kind of focusing on naming and measuring and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of America and the nation. Can you speak a little bit to what it means to name racism, and how do we really think about how it's essential to addressing the impact on BIPOC or marginalized communities?
Oh, thank you for that question. And I'm going to have to rein myself in. You're going to have to give me
I got you covered. We're going to get there.
So I'm just going to say two things about it. First, 5 years ago, when I was president of the American Public Health Association, was when I launched that association, and as many other associations and communities as would join us, on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks. The first is to name racism, because if you don't name a problem, you'll never be able to address the problem. The second is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? Now I'll go into a little more detail on that in a sec. The third is then to organize and strategize to act. Again, this notion of collective action is power. Now, the how is racism operating here piece will help us identify levers for intervention, because as important as it is to name racism, and I use a lot of storytelling, allegory to help people name racism. In fact, I use allegories to identify 4 key messages: that racism exists, that racism is a system, that racism saps the strength of the whole society, and that, yes, we can act to dismantle racism. So all of that, the allegory and stuff, that's how I do the naming racism. But if we stopped there with just naming racism, then racism denial, which is so staunchly held in this nation and so seductive, may in 6 months make us forget why we named racism, and we might fall back into what I describe as the sleepiness, the somnolence of racism denial. So we must move to action, right? And moving to action involves the second and the third, asking how is racism operating here, to identify levers for intervention, and then organizing and strategizing to act. I think I'm not going to go so deep on that. You can come back to me another round, but I do want to say one more thing. And that is that in my life, because you might ask, family physician, epidemiologist, why is she up in here? Why is her work about, racism at all? I just want to give you a little timeline and tell you what I think what we need to attend to right now. As a physician, understanding that race is not biology, I started out trying to figure out, well, why do we see so much difference in terms of infant mortalities, maternal mortality, hypertension, diabetes, all by race? Why do we see these health outcomes by race? So it went from race to racism. That's racism is the root cause of all of these racial health disparities. So then I was developing measures of racism, doing all that. And then I understood we have to go beyond naming to action. So it went from race to racism to anti-racism. And you might think, oh, but that's where you are right now. But no, there's one more step that we all need to take, because in anti-racism, why is it so hard? It's because of the huge black hole of racism denial. Think of a black hole in the universe. Why do they call them black holes? Because we can't see them. Why can't we see them? Because they are so massive that even when light comes anywhere near it, it gets sucked in. Racism denial in this nation is a huge black hole that is the huge barrier for us moving in our anti-racism work. In our anti-racism work, we have to understand what we have to do and what the barriers are. We see the racism denial now with all this anti-critical race theory stuff going on. People don't want to talk about racism, about history, social justice, none of it. So I've gone from race to racism to anti-racism to the importance of confronting racism denial. And I think that's where we as artists, journalists, all of us need to be.
Okay, Dr. Jones, listen. Now, I don't know how in 2 minutes you were able to give a treatise on how to address this. This is amazing. And so much to unpack there. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about what you said is the fact that we think we're one place, but we're really somewhere else. And I think that dissonance and that disconnect is something that we all can contribute to working on, to keeping that conversation happening. And as I think of the work of Dr. Yip around really focused energy in addressing your identity internally. Right? What are the connections between how we are addressed in the community, but then internally? I think in a recent interview, you were with, I think, the American Psychological Association, and you mentioned that people have a clear sense of ethnic identity. Those that have that clear sense are better adjusted overall, better able to buffer the mental health impact of discrimination. Right? So some of us can do that. So in what ways do you think our communities, our BIPOC communities, can foster that stronger sense of identity to get at some of these items that Dr. Jones mentioned? And how does that representation then in the news and the media kind of impact, even in the art spaces, that sense of identity from your perspective?
It's a beautiful segue, Tramaine. Excellent. Yeah, I love how you weave that together. So I think this identity is just sort of an individual sense of how you belong to a community, right? So it's this psychological sense of belonging. And we've talked a lot about community. And so what does that mean for BIPOC individuals? It means belonging to, racial ethnic community, which is primarily what I study in terms of identity, but it also means connecting to your neighborhood community or a religious community or any other community that provides you with a sense of belonging, right? That communicates to you, you belong, you are one of us. And that sense of belonging is really important because what it does is it gives us similar others that we can then connect with to say, hey, this happened to me. Oh, has it happened to you, right? So it gives us a sense of you're not alone. And I think that's really important psychologically because then it allows us to sort of branch out a little bit to sort of see how do other people who've encountered this deal with it? And what are ways that I can sort of be a part of something larger than myself? And I think that's incredibly important, especially now, in the midst of the pandemic when people are isolating. I mean, less so now, but in the early days of the pandemic, we were, physically, socially isolating. And so that sense of isolation made it that much more difficult for us to feel connected to our communities. And it made it that much more of an effort to feel connected to our communities. But what our research suggests is that sense of connection does, in some sense, armor us with a psychological shield, if you will, for combating or at least mitigating the negative mental health and physical health consequences of racism and discrimination.
Tramaine, we can't hear you for some reason.
All right. And there we are. I think we are there. I get one of those a day. Everyone that has been in this experience of Zoom world gets one of those mute opportunities a day. And so there's my one, and we're moving forward. So I think one of the things that is really incredible about what you were saying, Dr. Yip, it was around this connection to who we are, how we see ourselves. And then sometimes we have some struggles with how we are able to do that, and where we're able to even sense our own identity and our own sense of identity in terms of how others view us. And sometimes one of the ways we can do that is address that through therapy. And I know, Adriana, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, you are a therapist who was in that seat of, do I go and engage in therapy, right? And so if you could just give some advice to those that might be listening about what ways would those that are interested but a little hesitant, maybe they don't think they can afford it, maybe they're looking for someone from a similar background to have that, resonance there and don't know if they can find someone. Do you have any resources around that? And what advice would you give them if they're hesitant to take part?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And also a common one. I think that there's a lot of demystifying that is still needed around finding a therapist. And so I do recommend that if anyone is interested in going for the first time, or maybe you've done individual therapy, but you're interested now in couples or interested in now for your child, et cetera. There's so many different types that you really think about, what is it that I want to talk about in therapy? What is it that I need to talk about in therapy? What kind of therapist do I envision for myself? Because there are some therapists that are maybe a little bit more passive and others that are more assertive, right? More direct with their approaches. It depends on the theories that they are using. I recommend people doing a little bit of research into what modalities maybe they can envision themselves that would be effective for them. Because truly, we are our own experts in what can work for us. And we can definitely try some modalities, but it's very important to take that free 15 to 30-minute consultation call with a therapist to ask questions. That's your opportunity to interview them as well, and ask them, how would you approach, treating someone with something that I'm seeking help with? Give them scenarios, ask them, how many years they have treating. All of that is absolutely acceptable. And in terms of resources, I also want people to know that therapists in private practice, most therapists hold a certain number of sliding scale slots or even pro bono slots for folks that cannot afford their full fee. So make sure that you also ask for those slots, who's eligible, and how you can have access to them. Again, like all of these questions are so important during the consultation call so that you can then make a choice. Now, if you have insurance and you want to go through your insurance, that's completely okay too. But what you do is you call the insurance directly to get a list of providers that specialize with what you're needing. So whether that's depression, anxiety, trauma, or anything else that's billable for them. And so, because there's also some bureaucracy with insurances too, unfortunately, but something that's billable and you get the list within your state. Right now, because we're in the pandemic and things are online, as well as therapy services, people think that therapists can see folks across state lines. And unfortunately, we can only see folks within the state that we are licensed in. And so, although we're a little bit more accessible, we're only accessible to those in the state that we're licensed in. And that's why we cannot accept insurances from other states. So calling your insurance provider is going to be the best. And if you're looking for all around sliding scale, then I do recommend openpathcollective.org. They are a nonprofit where therapists go on and offer their sliding scale slots, and the rates are anywhere between $30 and $60 a session. And there's also other mental health organizations nearby, depending on your area. But there should be mental health organizations that offer pro bono or very, very low, under $30 sliding scale slots. And those will require a little bit more research. And the reason why they are pro bono or sliding scale is because they are funded by the state. So these are typically state funded. They have grants. And so you're looking for mental health nonprofit organizations.
Those are such incredibly rich resources and opportunities for people to get engaged. And I was thinking about, as a follow-up to that, the fact that we're in this digital experience right now, right? And the fact that there's so many other resources that maybe we didn't think about before. I know over the last 18 months, people have been more open online because we had to be, right? Being in community online looks different. And then there's a measure of access and who has access and who does not to those spaces. And so I'm so grateful that you shared those that are accessible in ways that we might think about what we can do, even if we can't get those traditional resources. One of the things that I'd love to say, and I know it's a quote from someone that I'm blanking on at the moment, but inherent in a community is the ability to heal itself, right? And so how are we looking at those opportunities for resilience within community? So are there other resources that you all would recommend about being in community with others as we think about really addressing and addressing our own well-being in that way? So that's open to any of you at this moment. Yeah.
I would like to start by saying that sometimes we ignore the communities that we're already part of, be they social or work-related or geographic. So I think to just engage with those around us in different ways. I think about that also in terms of the power that we sometimes just leave on the table or on the floor, in terms of putting important items on agendas. So I think that so many of us have had the experience of connecting with family members across the country or even in other countries in a way that we didn't do before. So I think that we need to recognize that we already have connections with others, but we can cultivate them. And it might even be easier right now in this Zoom space to cultivate the distant ones where we couldn't think about traveling but once a year, and we didn't think about calling or whatever, but we can get on an every month Zoom call. So I think we need to think about who's already in our space and then cultivating those resources and making ourselves available to be a resource to them, not a one-way street at all.
Love that. Love that. Dr. Yip, did you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I would add to what Dr. Jones has said is that sometimes these communities are maybe not ones that we had even thought of, right? And maybe having a brief conversation with someone in the grocery store, as you're checking out, or, conversation with your mail carrier. Those we may not think initially, first come to mind when we think of our community, but they are members of our community, right? So community can be anyone that crosses your path in your daily life, whether virtually or in person. And I think if we sort of expand our thinking about what community means and who's in our community, we'll find that we're much more connected than maybe we thought we were.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. I was doing a little bit of healthy internet stalking of the three of you before we arrived today. And one of the things I uncovered was this quote, Dr. Jones, and I've heard you say, the edge of our comfort is our growing edge. And that edge as it relates to our allies and those who might not yet be allies, or those might identify as accomplices in this work, right? I just really love that quote. And so I'll start with you for this last question, but it is for all of us, because we do want to open this up to everyone else to from the audience to type in those questions and get to the audience questions. But for anybody who's identifying as an ally today and they're watching, in what ways can they really support BIPOC creators specifically during this time, these really times of distress and very heightened sense of challenge? What are those ways that they can really support? And I'll start with you, Dr. Jones. I'll come to you, Adriana, and then to Dr. Yip.
So I missed a little bit of it, but I think I got the question. My internet is unstable, but I hear you asking, how can allies support BIPOC folks? Okay. So first of all, I don't like the term allies, and I'll tell you why. It's because racism has three impacts. Yes, it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, but every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. So yes, it's unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities, but beyond that duality, racism is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. If people consider their position of advantage and think of themselves as allies, but don't understand that the whole system is being sapped of its vitality, then they might have a more tentative relationship with the struggle, if you will. And it might be that, they might say to a friend, I'm going on vacation for 2 weeks, check you in 2 weeks, hope the struggle goes well. I mean, it's not like that. We are all really in this together. Racism is sapping the strengths of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And we have to recognize that it's a problem for all of us. So instead of being, even the term, maybe be a compatriot or something like be squarely in the struggle. Because the thing that people who would say allies or whatever, but people who are not unfairly disadvantaged by the system and who are in fact unfairly advantaged, wanting to use their power, use their entitlement, use their advantage for the struggle, all good. The other thing that I sometimes heard is that people say, well, but I don't really know if I should, go into that part of town. Like, how would it look for me as a white woman, for example, doing that? Well, then first of all, it would look fine if you're about to struggle. But the thing is, maybe that's not where you need to go. Maybe you need to go to your country club or to your neighborhood, or maybe you need to go to your school board meeting, or maybe you need, which is all white, places where I could go and I could tell a gazillion stories for a month, and my allegories would have no impact, not the impact that you would have by asking a question. Why are we doing this? Why are we uncomfortable here, et cetera, et cetera? So I observe, getting back to your initial lead about the edge of our comfort being our growing edge, I observe that in this nation, one of the things that's highly valued is comfort. And when people start moving to the edge of their comfort, they recoil. People are trying to be comfortable, not recognizing that the edge of our comfort is our growing edge. And there's that tension between comfort and social justice. And we need, especially those who would be allies, need to recognize that kind of dual thing and recognize that they need to go beyond the edge of their comfort. For all of us, for me, for all of us, the edge of our comfort is our growing edge, but especially recognizing that there's almost a wall between comfort, which is the status quo, which is what is right now, and social justice, which is not what is right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That tension, right? And I love that there's still this thread of naming right? How do we use our words? And what words do we choose to use? Even inherent in using a term like BIPOC, right? There's this opportunity to be who we are as individuals and name accordingly as we see fit. So coming over to you, Adriana, for a comment on that. How can others help and join in that?
Yeah, well, I'm left very reflective right now. So thank you for that. I'm learning so much, but I think in, in general, how can others help? Um, Making spaces safer, and I know that safe, the word safe is also could be a triggering word, but thinking, how can I be more inclusive? How can I, amplify someone else's voice? So in the digital world, that goes really, really far, and also in in-person spaces. My mind is a little bit there because we've been in quarantine for so long. But I think the amplification of BIPOC voices is so crucial, and also making sure that if you're hiring BIPOC folks, that you also pay accordingly, right? Making sure that you're not tokenizing as well, because that happens so much in the world when you're trying to do good, but you end up hurting the community you're trying to help. So I think those are some of the things that I've noticed with the folks that I've worked with.
Absolutely. And Dr. Yu?
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to idea that racism isn't something that just happens to people of color, right? That is a system of oppression. And if you take it from that perspective, you come to understand things like vicarious racism, right? So this is the notion that you don't have to be targeted by racism for it to impact you, right? So if people you love and care about are affected by racism, that actually impacts your own health, right? Your own mental and physical health. So you don't even have to necessarily be the target for racism to have an impact on you. So if we come to understand that sort of like fabric of racism, then we come to understand the really large impact that it has on everyone, right? Not just BIPOC individuals. And so I think if we take this more systems societal perspective on the impact of racism, then it becomes everyone's responsibility, right, to address and combat it. So how do we do that? I think we do that with a sense of humility, right? That we are coming in to learn and understand maybe about the communities that we know less about. What does that look like? And so I think if you approach this learning with humility and grace, it'll take you a really long way into truly understanding the impact that racism has for certain communities, but also acknowledging the impact that it has on everyone, right? Regardless of your BIPOC status, right? That it truly is a system societal level issue that we are all responsible for addressing.
I love that. I love that. And I know Dr. Jones, it looked like you wanted to also give an additional comment there. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Yep.
Yes, thank you. I am just loving you guys. And please call me Camara because you've been calling different people different things. So anyway, Camara.
No worries.
But so for Dr. Yip, thank you for saying that. Structural racism, it's hard for people to understand because we're so narrowly focused on the individual. It makes systems and structures invisible or seemingly irrelevant. We're ahistorical. We act as if the present were disconnected from the past. Many reasons. We endorse the myth of meritocracy. But I want to tell you, for those who say, but I don't see structural racism right now. Structural racism these days very often shows up as indifference or inaction, lack of action in the face of need. So that is how it's mostly showing up. So we have to develop this sensitivity of the absence of. We have to see the absence of who's at the table, who's not, what's on the agenda, what's not, what policies are in place, what policies are not in place. That's a very good sensitivity to have. But if you see inaction in the face of need, boom, there it is, structural racism, I'm telling you, okay? The other thing I want to say is for individuals who are like, well, what can I do? Read history, okay? Done, read history.
Absolutely. I mean, we can stop there. We can be done there, but there's some great questions that have come in, and thank you, Camara, Tiffany, and Adriana for just such dynamic answers and insights. I feel like this has been a class this morning, just an education session for me, and for so many that are watching. And I still invite everyone to go ahead and put questions into the chat box, in the chat box feature. And this rich discussion doesn't have to stop today. This is the first panel, right? This is the first panel that we're doing live here for the Peace Studio Summit, and so excited about the continued conversation. And it doesn't have to stop with us. We can continue this chat afterwards, but I want to dig into some of these questions because they're amazing. So Maya wants to know, as professionals that are so entrenched in this work, right? The three of you, in related to race and mental health, what do you specifically do, to take care of yourselves? Because we can talk a lot about what people should do. One of my colleagues says, don't should on people. So we can talk about what people should do, but what are you doing specifically to take care of yourselves?
I can go first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, I'm going to be honest. Sometimes I cry and it feels so good. And when I can't, I know I need to do something more physical to help me get those toxins out. And so that's one of my go-tos. I'm in therapy so that I can, because I'm a trauma therapist. I hold so much. I'm raising a child. There's a lot going on in my life. And so I need that support as a helping professional. And so I make sure that I'm taking care of myself in that way, that I'm moving my body because, all of my stress tends to be held in my body. And so I need a way to let it out if it's not crying, because sometimes my body doesn't need to cry. Sometimes it just needs to move, right? And so daily movement is something that is so crucial, especially as we've been stuck in that pandemic, doing teletherapy, talks, in a sitting way. And another way is personally also boundary works. So knowing what boundaries do I need to have in place for myself? Do I need to work outside? Do I need to take a mental health day today and not work potentially? And like how Dr. Yip was mentioning earlier, making sure that I'm also drinking water, enough water. I'm just giving myself, my body, what it needs, and making sure I still have a social life, because I did cut myself off during the beginning of the pandemic because I didn't know what was happening. My practice was getting full due to the mental health crisis that was increasing. And so I didn't have time to socialize, and my mental health suffered during that time. So having a balance of my basic needs and more is how I take care of myself.
That's awesome. That's wonderful.
I'll go next.
Anyone? Yeah. Awesome.
So Adriana already said a few things that I do. So I run. I've actually started running a mile, so it's not a long distance, but every morning. And I drink lots of water. In fact, that's what I drink is water. I do puzzles. So, crossword puzzles. And so New York Times crossword puzzle every day. And I have a streak that's 200 some odd days long. So, so that's good. So it's also becoming a compulsion. And I just learned about spelling bees. So I'm going to start that. But I also sing. And that's the part that's really gone down in the pandemic, because I used to sing at church and I used to sing as part of a community chorus. And I'm not ready to do that yet, safety wise. And I guess I just want to say this. We're feeling so. Earlier in the summer, many people felt like, oh, the pandemic is over. New York City gave a parade for, first responders. As long as the pandemic is raging any place on the planet, none of us is safe. We need to be concerned about how much of the vaccine supply we've sequestered in this country, so that, some people are talking now about third doses, and in many nations, people haven't had their first dose. So we need to bring political pressure. We need to keep our mask on. I'm not saying I'm not trying to prolong things, but that would be in the same way that racism works, our American privilege is working too. And we're blind to that. So that's way off topic, but all to say that I'm not singing because I am concerned, because even though I've been vaccinated twice, old enough to get the third one when that comes around, right? Wear mask and all of that. We are not safe. And we need to make sure that the world is safe and the vaccine is getting where it needs to be. We cannot feel entitled to this. We need to work. That's part of our activism too.
Yeah, absolutely. And not off topic. It's all connected. It is all connected. Tiffany, did you have something as well?
Yeah, I think I love what Adriana was saying about balance. So for me, in the sort of middle of the pandemic, which we might still be, but I remember feeling so fatigued physically by racism that it was like in my bones, like in the center of my body, that I could feel this fatigue. And I remember the only thing that made me feel, well, one of the things that made me feel better was expressing that level of fatigue to someone else who I knew could relate. Right. So when we talk about balance, the balance of, I think that in the earlier panel, they talked about cocooning, which I love that term. So cocooning, right? So protecting sort of boundary, but then the balance between that and communities, right? So what is that balance for you in terms of reaching out and also reaching in, and what does that look like? And also, I think another thing for me was just even like, along the theme of naming, telling people I'm feeling exhausted, or not doing certain things, like all of us as activists are ready to speak out and advocate, but there were also several times in this past year where I had to say no, right? So I was the geese that moved to the back of the line, and I need another geese to come forward because I couldn't do it, right? So also having that boundary to say, hey, I'm gonna back out of this one, but here's someone else in my flock that I would recommend. That was really important for me.
Absolutely. No is a complete sentence. And it's a great reminder for us that are always giving and entrenched in this work. And especially for those of us who are creators and creatives, right? We pour ourselves into this work in a different way. It has a different impact. And so how do you think art itself can make that impact and that expression can make a difference around mental well-being and the reverse, right? How can that help around mental health, specifically, there we go, in the BIPOC communities?
I feel like art is an act of liberation. Mm-hmm. It's a form, it's a method. And so I really feel like some folks speak from their heart, from their soul when they engage in art. And art, there's so many different forms of it, whether it's painting, whether it's dancing, whether it's singing, there's all sorts of form of art. And so I see it as a big art of a big engagement of liberation when folks engage in that. And so just like how Dr. Jones was mentioning earlier in relation to her singing, it's a way to, feel like this is something that's connected to me. This is my self-care. This is what liberates me. So I feel like it's a strategy for some people, and for others, it's passion. So people get to define it however they want, right? But art in the BIPOC community is essential for many folks. My type of art is more so on social media and how I put my words together, and when I feel safe enough to post them, because sometimes I don't, and sometimes I want to keep that art to myself until I feel a little bit more ready to release it out to the public eye. And so everybody has that right as well. And I feel like that's the beauty with art.
And art is for the creator, and it's also for the community. Mm-hmm. And so it's healing for the creator, and it can be healing for the community. It binds us. We don't have to see things the same way, but we can all see it. And my art of storytelling, of allegory, when I put a story out there, it's for everybody to shape and mold and reject or embellish. So I think that they're the two aspects of it, the binding and the communication aspect of it, and also the healing aspect of it.
I agree. I think one of the beautiful things about the possibility of art is that art transcends the artist, right? So if we're thinking about moving past racism, if we're thinking about advocating an anti-racist agenda, art is a unique medium where, it almost doesn't matter who the artist is, right? Of course it does, but it also is a place where you can communicate with people, peeling away these social constructs of race, right? Peeling away all these labels that we've given each other. So I think it's an important and unique medium for us to think about how to advance an anti-racist agenda.
Such beautiful sentiments. I mean, whether it's writing or it's the singing and that expression, or storytelling, or just being in community, and it's something that's freeing about that and liberating about that, and then energizing when we do that in community. I think one of the things that it's a complicated situation. I mean, if we could sum up this whole discussion, and I'm so sad that I could talk to you three all day. I'm so sad we're coming to the close here soon, but as we do, it's a lot going on. And we have constant exposure to crisis, Adriana, as you mentioned, to trauma on a regular basis, right? And so for people who are on the front lines of this, the journalists, the storytellers, Camara, what would each of you suggest as one thing, right? One of my goals this year is to just focus on one thing. There's so much that's happening. Sometimes that mindfulness of just focusing on the one thing is going to be really critical. So what is that one thing that you would tell our audience today that they could do to better take care of their health in this particular time that we're in right now? Don't jump all in at once. I know that was a huge question, but if you had to boil it down to one thing, what would that one thing be?
Value yourself.
Yeah.
Value yourself. Awesome.
And one way to do that I found helpful is, just quieting the mind sometimes, just quieting the mind, doing meditation, whether it's, a guided meditation or just sitting quietly and breathing like we did in the intermission before this session. I think if there's one thing, because you can do that anywhere, right, at any time. So I think it's a valuable tool.
And I'm going to say, learn about muscle relaxation. And so sometimes, you may be like this and not even notice. But if you just give yourself permission to just lower, your shoulders, to release the muscles in your belly, to release, everything that you're holding in your body, soften your hands, soften your toes. I think that goes such a long way. So becoming more attuned to your body is a skill that is so essential for us in life, especially as activists. And so that's what I would say, give yourself permission to heal in many different ways.
Absolutely. Permission to heal, focusing on ourselves, finding those ways to energize, to continue that work for tomorrow. You have just profoundly impacted my day, my weekend, and this summit, the three of you. And so we're so grateful for this conversation. I'm so sorry to see it end. And so thank you for your insights, for sharing this space with everyone and helping us to really delve into what we can do and how we can really address our well-being. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today for this important panel. To our panelists, thank you again. So grateful for your time and for your light in this world. If you, as the audience, would like to attend an optional reflection session to speak with other audience members about what we just talked about, It was a great discussion. I want to continue this discussion. Please go ahead and head over to the Connect page on the Peace Studios Summit website. And otherwise, we'll see you back here at 1 p.m. Eastern for our first lunchtime concert. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tramaine.